Hello and welcome to the session on the future of work. I'm Almaz Zelleke from NYU Shanghai. I'll be the moderator for this session, and we will have presentations from Michael Howard, Fan Wu, Fernando Gimenez, and Kelsey Berg. We're going to begin with Michael Howard. Michael is a professor of philosophy emeritus from the University of Maine. Welcome, Michael.
And welcome everybody else who is here today. The challenge we all face from climate change is how to keep the global temperature from rising beyond 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels without locking hundreds of millions of people in extreme poverty and without imposing painful austerity on the most vulnerable in wealthier countries. This is a matter of justice, but also of political feasibility, because if we don't attend to what we owe to the least advantaged among us, we will not get the necessary cooperation to solve the climate problems. The genesis of this paper it's a response to a question that was posed to me by Philippe Van Parijs at a paper I gave for Louvain-la-Neuve earlier this year. And the question had to do with the compatibility of work time reduction and global justice obligations. That paper, I was arguing for several things. I argued that basic income in response to climate change involves two policies. First, carbon pricing and dividends, which would yield a kind of partial basic income. And then beyond that, ecological basic income to support work time reduction and work sharing, and thereby reduce demand for energy, which would come closer to a full basic income. As Philippe has argued many times, the old strategy for creating employment and distributing income involved growing the economy and investing in jobs. This has been faltering for many years, and it also collides with environmental limits to growth, notably global warming, but also other forms of environmental overreach. The strategy we need now will rely less on growth and more on redistribution. In other words, a basic income for distributive justice and a robust climate change policy. The question that was put to me about work time reduction is, do we really want to reduce work and then just sit back and enjoy the sweet life? Or should we frame this as consuming less in the global north, but continuing our work effort? And Philippe has developed that argument further in a paper earlier this year, and I believe it looked like the content of his address earlier in the conference. In his own words, consuming less in the global north does not mean producing less in the global north, because production in the north must help fund consumption in the south. Consequently, there is no realistic scenario for global justice that can dispense with massive financial transfers from the north to the south. I completely agree with that assessment, and just to elaborate, remind everybody that the historical emissions of carbon dioxide have been predominantly from North America and Europe, and they have left very little in the way of a carbon budget for either 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. In particular, at current global emissions rates, according to the IPCC latest report, the 1.5C budget will be depleted in 6 years, and the 2C budget in 18 years. And if you take that 1.5C budget and you distribute it per capita globally, that means that we are allowed per person between now and 2050 only about 1 ton of carbon dioxide per person. And yet globally, we're currently putting into the atmosphere about 6 times that. In North America, almost 20 times that. So what is a fair share of the remaining carbon budget? Peter Singer has argued for that equal per capita shares, where everybody would get 1.1 tons per capita per year. But at that rate, even sub-Saharan Africa would need to make significant emissions cuts. The problem with equal per capita shares is that it ignores all that past pollution. It also ignores ability to pay, and it leaves too little room for development out of poverty, an injustice which developing countries simply will not accept. Therefore, wealthy countries must assume even more responsibility than equal per capita shares because of their past emissions and because of ability to pay with minimal suffering. Now, if you calculate what that equal per capita share would be, it would come to about the US, which is puts in 14% of CO2 emissions annually. A fair share would be about 37% responsibility for global emissions. And that means that the United States would have to reduce its emissions by about 190% between now and 2030. And it's very difficult to reduce emissions by more than 100%. The way that the obligation for the United States would have to be met is to reduce emissions as much as we can, but then pay the cost of emissions reductions elsewhere. The organization US Fair Shares, which has used the same modeling implement that I've been using, has argued that we should try to reduce emissions in the United States by about 70% by 2030, which is considerably beyond what's been pledged, and then assume responsibility for even more emissions reductions in other parts of the world, in places like China and particularly India. I'm going to skip over those slides. This will involve very large cash transfers from the United States. Estimates vary considerably, but even the lowest estimate is about 57 billion per year, up to a high of about $500 billion. And reasonable estimates can be found in between. The Biden administration's current pledge by 2024 is only a fraction even of the smallest of those estimates. Now, the problem for work time reduction, in addition to taking into account our global obligation, has to do with threats to productivity. If we restrict fossil fuel use, as Philippe von Parijs has argued, we will necessarily, other things equal, decrease labor productivity, and therefore more labor will be needed for the same amount of goods. Another way to put that is more labor will be needed to produce a given level of GDP out of which a UBI is funded. And a decline in work effort would mean an even lower UBI. As Philippe concludes, faced with the prospect of falling productivity, therefore, we cannot nonchalantly respond that we shall work less and relax, contenting ourselves with a lower level of consumption. If we believe in global justice, the degrowth of northern consumption should rather be combined with whatever additional efforts are needed to prevent falling productivity to show in falling production. Introducing an unconditional basic income in this context does not exactly seem the soundest thing to do. He points out a couple of mitigating factors to this conclusion. Automation may more than compensate for productivity losses, and UBI may itself enhance productivity as a sort of venture capital for people if it is combined with lifelong learning and promotion of local communities. But it is clear that the position he's arguing for, we envision an ecological basic income not as something that simply facilitates la dolce vita. The question I ask here is it politically feasible to ask working people to reduce consumption, but to sustain their work effort? Von Parijs's response to this is that the younger and future generations in the global north will need to content themselves with less material consumption than what our generation could get away with. To make this fact acceptable to them, indeed to make them embrace their future enthusiastically in spite of this fact, one needs to offer them a realistic utopia. The emancipatory idea of an unconditional basic income must feature at the core of such a realistic utopia. An emancipatory basic income is an income that affords real freedom, or in Karl Weidequist's phrase, the freedom to say no, the freedom to form your own communities for work and living, UBI must therefore be high enough to make good on this promise. Question I have here is whether a UBI at the poverty line would be high enough. I'm not going to try to answer that, but I will simply point out that even a UBI pitched at, let's say, $12,000 per person per year, for most people will still leave them seeking meaningful and useful work. 2 points I want to make. First of all is that work time reduction is compatible with sustaining overall work effort. First of all, if it's combined with work sharing, you can have fewer hours per person, but the same overall hours worked if you bring more people into employment. Work time reduction can also be facilitated through productivity improvements while maintaining the same level of work effort. As Juliet Shore has pointed out, a 4-day work week can be as productive as a 5-day work week with many environmental, health, and social benefits. Those global transfers I was talking about, which, by the way, can include a small global basic income to reduce extreme poverty and to stimulate demand for necessities, can also include subsidies. Can include subsidies for imports of green energy infrastructure and lead to new employment in the manufacturing countries. Second point I want to make is we need to look a little more closely at the distribution of wealth, income, and emissions. Emissions reductions in the global north should not and need not fall on the most vulnerable there. An ecological basic income need not be part of an austerity agenda. As most of you who are familiar with this hourglass symbol know, the richest 10% globally receive over half of global income. Wealth is even more unequally distributed. And carbon emissions track pretty closely with income. The top 10% of emitters are responsible for nearly half of global emissions, while the bottom 50% are responsible for only 12% of global emissions. Therefore, as Chancel, Piketty, and others have argued, the burden of emissions cuts by 2030 can and should fall on the more affluent, both in rich countries and in emerging countries. In the United States, for example, to reduce emissions by half by 2030, the top 10% need to reduce their emissions by about 90%, the middle 40% by about half, but the bottom 50% are already about where they need to be. And to use India by way of contrast, the bottom 90% have some room to increase emissions, although the top 10% still would need to decrease their emissions. Now, how to bring about responsibility on behalf of the wealthiest? Well, Chancel, Piketty et al. Argue that we should shift tax from consumption to assets. They propose a 10% tax on the value of carbon assets, which would raise about $100 billion a year, and it would also discourage investment in those assets. But more importantly, they argue for a 1 to 3% progressive wealth tax on millionaires, which would raise revenue at the amount of 1.7% of global income. And that's in the ballpark of what is needed for mitigation on a world scale. So to conclude, emissions reductions will require carbon pricing and dividends, and therefore a partial UBI. Public investments will be needed in green alternatives. There will also need to be reduced consumption in wealthy countries, and there need to be massive cash transfers to the global south. The reduced consumption can continue with green production. A full UBI should support more efficient, more freely chosen, and more sustainable work. The reduced consumption should be primarily by the upper 50% and especially the top 10%, imposed through wealth and asset taxes. Work time reduction is possible with work sharing, productivity gains, and continued work effort. The question I want to close with is, will there be enough resources left after the costs of energy transition for a full and emancipatory UBI. Thanks for listening.
Very much, Michael. Our next presenter is Fan Wu. Fan has a master's degree in the sciences from Princeton University, and he is going to be our next presenter. Fan, whenever you're ready. And I should say, I see that there's a question already in the participants chat. Thank you for that. We're going to hold questions until all of our presenters have gone.
Play the video audio.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here and talk about my topic today, which is an argument for basic income in the age of automation. Automation is a kind of technological change that is characterized by replacing human labor by technological substitutes. In recent years, it has been an increasingly driving force behind productivity growth, from which we benefit. However, it has also shown disruptive effects. It leads to unemployment, wage polarization, and insecure employment. Basic income, which aims to guarantee everyone a minimum standard of living, is promising to mitigate the disruptive effects of automation. But objections still exist. So we wonder, could it be possible to justify basic income as a new social contract in the age of automation? A possible way to justify a social contract may come from consensus. That is, almost every individual prefers the circumstances with basic income than without. However, because there is a diverse conception of goods, disagreement may be inevitable. As Waldron put, in the circle of politics, there is ubiquitous disagreement, but there is also a need for cooperation. So alternatively, the decision rule, which translating individuals' preference into the society's preference and does not rely on a specific notion of goods, may be used to make such justification. Specifically, he endorsed the majority rule. The majority rule may be good for situations with only two alternatives. However, if there are multiple alternatives to choose from, there will be a paradox known as a Condorcet paradox. Let's say if there are three alternatives, A, B, and C, the preferences look like this. So we found that for A and B, because the voter 1 and 3 prefers A to B, so it should be preferred socially by the society because the majority is 2. And similarly, by applying the rule to every pair, we find that the society preference should be A is preferred to B, B is preferred to C, and C is preferred to A. But such preference is not rational. Let's say if we are now at section A, the society may be willing to reform from A to C with some price, and also from C to B and B to A with some price. But eventually we go back to section A. We found that the price is paid, nothing is gained. And in the circumstances of diverse consumption of goods, there could be multiple alternatives, and we need to find a solution. But the problems also go with other rules. Error extended the result and proposed the impossibility theorem. That is, there exists no aggregation rule that satisfies the following 5 conditions. Now we take a closer look to the condition to see how to find a solution. Basically, some of the conditions should be relaxed. So let's say the universal domain condition. It basically says that the rule should find a solution for every possible voting profiles. So in order for our rule to be general, it should be kept. The weak Pareto principle says that if everyone prefers A to B, then it's a society. Because it is consistent with the consensus criterion, so it should be kept. The non-dictatorship says that the rule should not be dictatorial. And surely this should be kept. So if there is some condition to relax, it must be either ordering or the independence of irrelevant alternatives. In short, we use A. The other condition says that the preference should be complete and transitive. Completeness means that every pair is comparable. So that is for every alternative A and B, either A is weakly preferred to B or B is weakly preferred to A. transitivity means that the preference is kind of rational. So if A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, so A should be preferred to C. This could avoid the cyclic preference as we have shown before. A way to relax the ordering condition is to use quasi-transitivity instead. That is for any two alternatives A and B. So either one is strictly preferred to the other, or they are mutually indifferent. And also only the transitivity of the strict preference is kept, whereas the indifference relation may not be transitive. But only relaxing the condition in this way is not enough. Actually, the Jabbar theorem shows that if the rule satisfies the universal domain with Pareto principle, IA, and quasi-transitivity, the rule is not dictatorial. That's a good news, but it is oligarchical, which means that a group of oligarchs decide the social preferences. If they all agree that A is preferred to B, then it's a society. If some of them disagree, then the society will be indifference between A and B. So we need to also relax the IA condition. The IA condition says that if the order relation between A and B, it doesn't depend on other alternatives. It's kind of some independent. So practically, it can be used to prevent strategic manipulation in voting. So let's now use an example to explain. A good example is the Boda rule, because it satisfies all the conditions except the IA. So the Boda rule says that if there are M alternatives, and if an alternative is ranked K for a voter, then it gets a score of M minus K from that voter. So here, B is preferred to C, C is preferred to A, and A is preferred to D. So B is ranked first, it gets 3 points, and C gets a score of 2, and A gets a score of 1. And this is only a score for one voter. If we sum the score from all voters, then the total score will be the alternative's total score. And we can determine the social preferences by the total scores. So here is the example. If 11 voters prefer A to B to C, and 10 voters prefer C to A to B, and 9 voters prefer B to C to A. To determine the social preferences, we need to calculate its total scores. And eventually we find that A gets a score of 32, B gets a score of 29, and C got a score of 29. And so A is strictly preferred to B, but B and C are mutually indifferent. So here is another problem. What if we introduce another alternative, which is a clone A, to this problem? A clone means that the individual preference over A and A prime are exactly the same. So now the preferences go like this. And we can recalculate the scores and find that now this time C gets a high score, which is kind of surprising because introducing a clone will change the rank, its social preferences, and actually it's quite dramatically. So we may wonder, the IA condition is important. How should we relax it? So in our setting, because there is a variety of notion of goods and they can be correlated, so we shouldn't relax the IA condition too much. At least we want it this way. If we're introducing a clone of the alternative, we don't want the ordinal relationship between A and B to be changed. This condition is called the independence of clones by Tederman. And as we said before, the Boda rule doesn't satisfy, so it is not that very satisfying. So it is not very satisfactory. There are some proposed methods like the rank pair method, the Schultz methods. They are independent clones, but there could be another problem that it allows society's preferences over A and B to be different from the majority's preference over A and B. The reason behind it is that they use the strict ordering preferences. So we should also relax ordering conditions. So in the end, we need to find a solution which is consistent with the majority preference and also independence of clones. Therefore, we need to relax both the IA and both the ordering relation. So we propose a new solution. It basically goes like this. We will replace the majority criterion with the supermajority criterion. Let A be a number that is less than half, and let P denote the percentage of voters who prefers A to B. If P is greater than 1 minus A, which is greater than 1/2, then it is strictly preferred. And also, if P is less than A, then B is strictly preferred. If the percentage is some value in between, then the society is indifference between A and B. And note that this is actually different from the supermajority rule, because the supermajority rule is asymmetric. It has different quotas for A and B, but it's resolute. So in our case, the threshold for A and B is actually the same. It is both 1 minus A, but it is not determinate because it allows the indifference relation. Also, to keep transitivity, we also do the following modification. Observing that if A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, then the percentage of voters who prefers A to C is greater than 1 minus 2A. So if we replace the quota from 1 minus A to 1 minus 2A, then the transitivity will also be kept. More generally, if there are n alternatives and the preference look like this, we can replace the quota by 8. As long as it is greater than 1/2, the preference, the society's preference is consistent with the majorities. Also, it can be shown that the rule is independent of clones. We now have a look at what the aggregated social preference will be look like. Actually, the preference ordering can be regarded as a directed acyclic graph. So on top of the graph, there will be some alternatives that are nevertheless preferred than other alternatives. So we call them the first order alternatives. So which is shown in the blue dot. And the red dot shows the second order alternatives, which are those only less preferred than some first order alternatives. Similarly, we can use definition for the third order and also the fourth order. And we note that alternatives with the same order are mutually indifferent. Therefore, we can roughly determine how an alternative is preferred socially by looking at its order. We shall now apply the rule to the circumstances with diverse conception goods. Let the alternative be whatever good from different conception goods. It could be a variety of items from primary goods, capabilities, liberties, right, and so on. The basic income has also been argued as an instrument of a specific good, like the real freedom, the effective control, self-ownership freedom. By applying the aggregation rule, its order can roughly represent how it is preferred socially. But prior to the age of automation, there's usually a trade-off between the higher order and lower order alternatives. That is, if individuals choose to satisfy the higher order ones, they may sacrifice lower order ones. And because in general, the higher order order alternatives are more preferred. So actually the lower order ones are sacrificed. So in the case of basic income, individuals are more likely to participate in some social corporations in order to get more important basic needs. But at the same time, they will have to sacrifice the free control of time. So with the automation and the increased productivity, higher order alternatives can be gradually satisfied. And this will change the problem, because if the higher order alternative is sacrificed, eventually it will be the case that the real freedom or the essential freedom become the most preferred but unsatisfied needs, which could imply a basic income. That's all. Thank you for your attention today. And I would also like to thank Professor Radcliffe for his early comments, and thanks for the organizing committee for coordinating the meeting.
Very much, Fan Wu. Next, we have Fernando Gimenez, who is Professor of Innovation and Sustainability at the Universidade Federal do Paraná. Fernando, when you're ready.
Hey, hello, everyone. Good morning for you, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Well, I'm quite excited to be part of this Congress. It's the first time I'm talking about basic income funds, and I believe I should tell you how this paper came up. From October last year until April this year, I spent 6 months in a postdoctoral research visit at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And one day I was walking out of my room at the university building, the School of Economics building, and one professor came to me and asked who I was or who I am. And so I introduced myself. I told him I am a Brazilian. I was there doing a postdoctoral visit, and he presented himself as Luca, an economics professor, and walked down, getting out of the building, and suddenly this professor told me, well, you know, I have a great admiration of a Brazilian person. So I was curious, I asked, who is this? And he said, well, I have a great admiration for Eduardo Suplicy, work on basic income. And I told him, well, I have this admiration as well. So we talked a little bit, and Luke told me, you know, there is a network that's called BM, and I have not heard about BM before. So I went back to my flat in the university, and I was at that time I kept thinking about what BM told me about Eduardo Suplicy and the network, BM network, Basic Income Earth Network. And at that time, I was reading this book. I hope you can see. It's a book by a Dutch historian, Rutger Bregman. It's a wonderful book. And in one of the chapters, Rutger talks about the paper, a lecture by a professor at the Utrecht University whose name is Tien de Moor. And this professor was giving her inaugural lecture as a professor of collective citizen collective or institutional collective actions. And suddenly I was inspired for this idea, and I became wondering, can I see any connections between entrepreneurial ecosystems and citizen collectives? It was a kind of insight. And in the same day, I decided to look for information about BN. And luckily, I found BN site in the internet, and I noticed that there was a call for a paper for this Congress. And then this paper idea came about, and I want to explain what I did, what was my reasoning. So this is what I call how a casual encounter, serendipity situation can lead us to some thinking. So my paper deals with the idea how can we connect entrepreneurial ecosystems, citizen collectives, and basic income. And it goes in this way. First of all, I learned with Professor Tien de Moor paper that citizen collectives are growing and spreading in many regions. And what are citizen collectives? Essentially, I learned with this that they are collective group efforts emerging in a bottom-up process seeking for long-term solutions for society's environmental, social, and economic problems. On the other hand, my field of research is entrepreneurial ecosystems, and this theme is also another growing field of social development. And so I said, well, perhaps there is a connection here. So in this paper, I have an argument saying that entrepreneurial ecosystems may be seen as citizen collectives. And I propose in the end that basic income initiatives should be included as an expected output of a sustainable entrepreneurial ecosystem. So the argument is quite simple and straightforward. Now, how did I get to this idea? First of all, I would like to show you a simple figure where I try to represent the different levels of an entrepreneurial ecosystem understanding of and what are entrepreneurial ecosystem. Essentially, the literature says that entrepreneurial ecosystem is a set of actors and factors that are interdependent and that from their interactions it can be possible that a favorable environment for entrepreneurial initiatives can emerge, can arise. So the idea is how can we have these systems working either in a local context or a regional context or a national context or even in a global context in a way that at the center of entrepreneurial ecosystems we can find actual entrepreneurs or potential entrepreneurs that may more easily develop their entrepreneurial initiatives. So this is a simple representation of this concept. And what we expect that the entrepreneurial ecosystem will deliver to society. Essentially, this is what I try to put in the arrows in the bottom of the figure. Well, we expect that entrepreneurial ecosystem can lead to productive entrepreneurship, and this leads to value generation, and an aggregate outcome of entrepreneurial ecosystem would be sustainable development. So this is the reason I thought, well, one can ask, but why can we see entrepreneurial ecosystems first as citizen collectives, and then why there would be a connection with basic income? So for us to understand that, I believe I have first to show you to tell you a little bit about the dynamics of entrepreneurial ecosystems. So the literature that discuss entrepreneurial ecosystems says that they are evolving systems, dynamic systems, and there are some elements of the system of entrepreneurial ecosystem that should understand. First of all, there are practices. These are activities that all actors in entrepreneurial ecosystem perform when interacting. And there are two main kinds of practice that we need to understand. First of all, there are networking practices that entrepreneurs in entrepreneurial ecosystem and other actors decide with whom to relate, why relate to others, and how to maintain these relationships over time. So there is a networking that connects people inside entrepreneurial ecosystems. The other type of practice is learning practice. So it's the need for entrepreneurs to acquire and develop knowledge. And there are mainly three types of learning activities: readings and training, education, formal or informal, experiential learning, learning from doing things, and vicarious learning, learning from observing other people doing things. Also, in the dynamics of entrepreneurial ecosystem, processes are important to understand. And processes are broader social and economic activities that result in the creation, reproduction, and transformation of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Especially important for this understanding of entrepreneurial ecosystem as citizen collective, I believe, is this articulation process. That is the process that guides the governance mechanism that strengthens ties between the actors of entrepreneurial ecosystem. And finally, entrepreneurial ecosystem can be seen also as narratives, or they have processual narratives that are local discourse that develop a sense of community. and shared purpose. Success stories are told, future-oriented scenarios are built and discussed. Identity building can come from narratives. Relevant issues for local development can arise from narratives in entrepreneurial ecosystem. And when I look at these attributes or process or practice of entrepreneurial ecosystem dynamics, I believe we can see how this brings an idea of entrepreneurial ecosystems as citizen collective. First of all, networking and learning practices are essential for collective action in entrepreneurial ecosystem. Entrepreneurial ecosystems emergence and development is rooted in cooperation and collaboration among those that decide to accomplish entrepreneurial activities. From this practice, exchange of knowledge, beliefs, habits, shared values, and a common sense of purpose may evolve. And this is the same with citizen collectives. Entrepreneurial ecosystems can be viewed as institutional forms that operate and depend upon their members' cooperation and collaboration practice guided by a shared sense of identity and common goal. So when you look at network and learning practice, I can see the connection between the similarity, on the other hand, of entrepreneurial ecosystem and citizen collectives. The other way, or the other reason, is looking at process and process of intended articulation and governance of individuals' entrepreneurial endeavors lead to a sense of belonging and identification with a local entrepreneurial community that can generate social, environmental, and economic values. And when we look at citizen collective, the same thing happens. So it's quite similar from what is expected of institutions for collective actions, is the other way of saying citizen collective. As well, in citizen collectives, the leadership role is also relevant in entrepreneurial action. This is so because it is in the leadership process that rules, institutions, norms, and culture prevailing in an ecosystem are strengthened, reevaluated, and eventually transformed. And lastly, the third connection between entrepreneurial ecosystems and citizen collectives is the phenomenon of a dual logic symbiosis. Yeah? This is the idea that first, there is a marked logic in entrepreneurial ecosystems in which values relate to innovation, new markets, business models, and technologies, creation and exploitation of opportunities, and risk-tolerant behavior are contained. Second, there is another logic of communitarian logic, which is represented by the predominance of collectives orientation, of broadly mutualist benefits, and high trust among the participants. This logic arises from the awareness of the community's needs and its quest for prosperity. So we can see that both in entrepreneurial ecosystem and citizen collectives, there's this dual logic of dealing with markets, but also dealing with cooperation and collaboration. And then I said, well, I can see entrepreneurial ecosystem as citizen collective. But is there a connection with universal basic income and entrepreneurial ecosystem? And then I made a quick search of previous studies that in a way have commented about the relationship of UBI and entrepreneurship. And I didn't find many papers. I did quite found a few papers that have addressed the idea, and some of them I have put in this slide. For instance, Ellert, Erickson, and Sanders in 2019 mentioned that UBI may be helpful both for R&D workers wishing to start innovative high-tech ventures and for the growing arm of everyday entrepreneurs that are important in entrepreneurial society. Another paper by Hofmeier and Zach 2021 says that UBR offers a financial buffer and thus potentially enables creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship among those with fewer economic resources. The third paper was by Di Mello 2019, saying that UBI may offer more individuals with entrepreneurial intentions new privilege to take on action on their ideas by increasing their ranges of affordable loans. And finally, the fourth paper I found was by Feinberg and Kuhn 2020, stating that UBI payments were initially correlated to increase in new small firm formation and self-employed options. So there are previous studies in the literature of basic income making connections with entrepreneurship. In the end, I came to the conclusion in my paper that from the actual leadership of entrepreneurs and the relational nature of entrepreneurial ecosystems, one can expect that this contemporary phenomenon might evolve towards a new form of institutional collective action aiming at localized geographical sustainable development. The search for a community sustainable development can be the future-oriented narrative that will guide actions of entrepreneurial ecosystem leaders and other stakeholders. However, a truly sustainable entrepreneurial ecosystem should have amongst its entrepreneurial outputs a concern for providing a basic income for everyone in its region of influence. And this could be in, in the form of a basic income fund, economic contributions of every entrepreneurial initiative that benefited from entrepreneurial ecosystem resource endowments and institutions. So in a way, I was quite happy when I received the information that my paper, my abstract was accepted because finally I would be able to attend this wonderful congress and learn a little much more than I have been able to learn when I was preparing this paper. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Fernando. And next, our presenter is Kelsey Berg. Kelsey is a PhD candidate in health sciences at the University of Lethbridge. Whenever you're ready, Kelsey.
Hi. Okay. Thank you so much. And yes, I'm so pleased to be here with all of you and to be participating in this conference. And yes, I'm joining you today. Well, it's your yesterday. It's the 27th. For me, it's the afternoon. I'm in Lethbridge. The University of Lethbridge is also known as Iniscum Medicine Stone. That's its Blackfoot name. And I've been very pleased to be part of this conference and to have been accepted to present my abstract and some preliminary findings from what is my actually doctoral research. And right, so quickly, what I will be presenting is largely my own research, an introduction to that, what I've done, my research questions, how I've answered them, and then I'll be bringing that into the focus of the future of work. That's how I approach this topic. So, some introduction to the issue. This is a wall of text here. So I want to localize myself in the field of social determinants of health. And as a Canadian researcher, what does that mean? We recognize that income really is here it's listed as the first, one of the most serious, significant determinants of health at population levels. So from public health perspectives in particular, but at individual levels, of course. And throughout this presentation, I will be going back and forth between sort of a macro level and a micro and the meso level. And there's many more perspectives, but this approach I'm taking is trying to bring these mechanisms into focus as well about what universal basic income is and can be. And I will get to work, but to be honest, that is actually not the focus of my thesis. But I'm still finding myself here. So basic income, from this public health perspective, it is a very promising policy. And that is actually a big part of the movement and the advocacy for basic income and universal basic income in Canada and across the world. And I, as a student, as someone who was looking for a PhD project, I said I was really trying to understand where these disconnects were in terms of the the evidence and the policy. We see it with basic income. We see it with all sorts of approaches to the welfare state, to building the welfare state. So this is also another analytical lens I'm bringing to this thesis, to this research, and to this understanding of basic income, that this is a welfare policy. And this is an essential feature, more or less, of welfare states as we currently have them, we currently experience them. So recognizing what we have for income guarantee is, I think, also an important part of our conversations on the future of work in particularly, and just the future as we envision it for basic income. Okay, so we have some. Why am I drawing us into news? Why news? This is, I think, a really interesting form of discourse to study when it comes to what we know about basic income. So the authority behind information systems is a critical juncture we can bring into our understanding of basic income and how we construct that and research it. And as the politicization of basic income policy becomes, I will say we can see this in the development of the UBI narrative, we can see really diverse constructs of basic income in the infosphere. So, of some methodology, some brief notes here. I'm looking at a sample of news, printed news, mainstream news media in Canada, printed 1 year before the COVID-19 pandemic and 1 year after. And I access these through just a standard database from Standard. It's kind of, it's an archive of news articles that have been published in Canada. And what I was trying to do is capture this in terms of themes and structure, so following a critical discourse analysis. And some typical tools there, which I won't get into too much today, just for lack of time. And you'll notice that the opportunity to study this discourse thread in terms of the pandemic was really seized upon. We've seen that in a lot of presentations throughout the conference so far. This political economy of crisis, how this has shifted the discourse, how we're conceptualizing basic income. And of course, I want to make some sense of all of this in terms of health equity and what we should be doing about this from a public health perspective. And that's where I'm drawing a lot on the practical tool, analytical tools from a field of research known as feminist political economy. And I'm highlighting one textbook there on social reproduction that I really appreciate. And I've kind of, to center us linguistically, when I'm using the term social reproduction, I'm not talking about biological or physical reproduction. I'm talking about the perpetuation of inequalities in social systems, the way these are transmitted, yes, through generations, and yes, through this raising. And this is, of course, I'm not trying to invite debate here at this point in the presentation. But to highlight the importance, I would say at this point, is of language and bringing a critical lens to this. So first, a bit of I'm calling this historical material breakdown of the sample. Where was the news on universal basic income printed in this time period? Most of the articles didn't come up after the pandemic, and most of the articles are coming from southeastern Ontario. And if you're familiar with Canada, you will see some gaps in population centers. So we're not seeing a perfect we're not kind of seeing an expected distribution right away. We're seeing interesting things. And there's many valid reasons for that, but I'll just draw attention to some details about the variables that I'm sort of looking for here in terms of ownership and copyright, and which you'll see highlighted there, and some other features of distribution. Oh, and the editorial nature of this issue as well, which lets us explore some narrative elements of universal basic income. So what do we see here? What is universal basic income? There is some general agreement in the news among news writers, news contributors, and they're not all professional news writers. There's a lot of editorials, editorial pieces from academics, from private individuals or leaders in coalitions. There is the messaging is around income security and freedom, this constant duality that we're always seeing in our discussions of universal basic income, this being important and integral to healthy communities. The political nature of basic income is really important in the news, and that's just probably a feature of news. For those of you who attended the session where MP Leah Dazan was speaking, the bill that she proposed was in the news. It was a topic, so it was discussed as an intertext. So it's very interesting to see what are the intertextual sources that are used to back this up and say what we have to say, but more on that later. Once I've established some patterns on what it is UBI is, how it's conceptualized, I'm then looking at and the way the stories are presented, the way these news writers are typically introducing their articles on UBI is in terms of what it is, why we're talking about it, justifying their speech acts, and then making some kind of projection about what this means. And it's not just 1, 2, 3, it's kind of a combination. You've all read the news, you know what this looks like. Pulling up some themes there was quite interesting, but I'll move on to some more of those structural pieces that I was talking about. So looking at a few levels of the structure here that I won't get too deep into for the sake of time, so we can go more into the relevance to work and the world of work. But we see some commonalities and a kind of a clear picture, or is starting to emerge, of what this policy is kind of coming into, or what the issues of the day, obviously, this is the news, how does it relate, these articles are presenting it in relation to these issues that are relevant to, I'm not saying that the news readership of these articles are direct reflections of, let's say, like democratically minded populations, but we do have some assumptions about our participation and our role and agency there as news readers. And that is, further evidence to who is able to contribute to the news. Pretty much, lots of people are writing about UBI. And I'm not speaking to editors or anything. They're not part of the research process yet. But it is just really interesting to look at more into the role of, not so much the role, but how this idea, this policy concept manifests, threads its way through our political informational systems. So that's the thesis, that's the research, and trying to ground all that in some kind of the place where I live, the local population. Here in southern Alberta, we have a lot of strong advocacy and support and intelligence behind the movement, I'll say, for universal basic income. There's so much more kind of awareness that could be part of our discussion on universal basic income. I'm seeing a lot of limitations already as I'm just starting to break down the way it's being presented, like by and large, to the public. And I am seeing, patterns of manipulation. Sadly, the tools of, the media, if it's not making someone angry, it's propaganda. I think that's Orwell. I think it is worth really thinking about what we mean here when we're talking about universal basic income. And we're thinking we have to put in the local context and learning from the history that we have, or the stories that we've inherited. And the limitations. So in terms of what we're seeing for income as a determinant of health, what we can confirm income, the way it manifests as health equity and health outcomes is really contextual. And I'm looking forward to reflecting back on the notes from the earlier sessions today, about how we arrive at these decisions about basic income, and the different angles and axes. I'm loving this entrepreneurial axis for basic income. That would fly really well in Alberta, actually, a population which kind of primes itself on this entrepreneurial spirit. The cultural determinants of health, getting more into the structural level, who these actors are, is relevant, and even just how we engage with each other. So there's some questions here that I'm working on as I'm treading through this research. The bigger picture of health inequalities that I think everyone really wants to be mindful of, or is just weighing on us. So we're dealing with climate change and rising inequalities and this threat atmosphere and an interest and just this public populism on the rise again. Do we see the inequalities that are in front of us? The emancipatory goals associated with universal basic income and the future of work. So I would kind of synthesize this off the bat as being from two main streams, minimizing the risk of labor exploitation and sustaining work that's not currently valued in labor markets. Some challenges there that we could be seeing that could be worth going into more. Is there some I'm going to just briefly throw out the terms erasure and recognition and the bringing in perspectives. This is something that also I'm really working on. I'm trying to bring into the final analysis. What does that mean? Who should be speaking? if we are thinking that it can actually, there is going to be some individual, so looking at the individual existing in their social structures, the various one, we're not making any assumptions about one income source here. We're very much seeing income guarantee as a part of a structure, the welfare structure. So that is my presentation. I'm going to leave you with these images of, these are from my walk to campus tomorrow. Oh my God, this morning. And when I'm kind of talking about how do we see and how do we envision this world, the road in front of us, the what we live in, the trying to capture these narratives, and the I was really hoping I wouldn't have to say the word performance in this presentation, but just the way that's lived out. What kind of work will we see? Will we value? Will it change? What I think is really important. So on the left, there's a city employee. There's a Lethbridge truck idling, and watching the robots, the automatic sprinklers, giving the lawn water that is just unnecessary. It's just going to blow into the system or freeze, or it's like we're talking about soil degradation, like harmful. Oh, that's my timer, and I think I'm like well over. And then just this final image, I just always think about, who this person is. Is he an actor trying to portray the reality of poverty? So I don't want us to get bogged down in the absurdism of my research when we all have really important and valuable contributions to the research here. So thank you so much for having me here. Is again here from Lethbridge, and happy to answer any more questions. And this has been a pleasure.
Kelsey. So let's open it up to conversation now, to questions from our audience, but also to any questions that any of the presenters have for their fellow presenters. I want to start with the question that was submitted by Indra Gessing. This is for Michael. Instead of worrying about sufficient productivity, would it help to instead maximize productivity such that independent of sufficiency, we are doing the best we can? What is the alternative? No social safety net is presumably worse for productivity. Are you ready to tackle that, Michael?
I'm not sure I fully understand the main focus of the question, but I certainly agree that no social safety net is worse for productivity. And I hope I didn't say anything to suggest that we should not have a social safety net or that there wasn't room for a basic income. But on the question of whether we should be increasing productivity and production, I think the point I was trying to make in agreement with Philippe van Parijs is that wealthy countries need to continue the sort of production that's needed. We need to be producing solar panels and wind turbines and other necessities that meet fundamental human needs. But there's also a problem with the consumption of what we might call luxury consumption and the production that goes to serve that, because that's a big part of the environmental overreach. And in countries like the United States, it's not just wealthy people. It's, as I suggested to you from some of the evidence, it's not just the top 10%, but the next 40% who are going to need to reduce their carbon emissions and their consumption. So if we're asking working people to reduce consumption, what are we offering them in return? And this is where basic income comes in, and particularly if it's emancipatory. if it offers real freedom. And if you're free to say no to certain kinds of employment, it at least opens the possibility that people will choose either through political channels or just in their own interactions to reduce their work time. What I wanted to argue in my presentation is that reducing your work time in the formal sense does not mean that you're reducing production. If you work more efficiently, you can maintain production and still reduce the amount of time that it takes. And you may be working in ways that are not traditionally recognized as paid employment, but nevertheless are contributing to the human needs both locally and globally. The luxury production, on the other hand, is where we need to see degrowth, both of luxury production and consumption, so that there can be room for growth in the global South. And I guess the last thing I would say, if the question was directed to my final remark about the cost of global justice requirements and the cost of basic income, the cost of global transfers from the United States are on the order of 250 billion to maybe as much as 500 billion. And that's a lot of money, even if you're imposing a 3% wealth tax on the wealthiest millionaires. The cost of a basic income, even at the poverty line, and I'm not talking about the gross cost, but the net cost, to give everybody every adult about $12,000 a year and every child about $6,000 is going to be on the order of $500 billion as well. So I don't mean this as a rhetorical question, but it's genuinely a real question for me, whether there's going to be a very serious challenge, how to balance the kinds of global transfers that are needed if we're going to have a global cooperative effort to reduce carbon emissions, and on the other hand, a solution within each country that is perceived to be just within the country. So you have both national level and global justice, how to balance those. I think that's a really important question we need to discuss further.
Thank you, Michael. And let me just invite any of the participants to put their questions in the participant question chat if you have questions for Michael or any other of our participants. If I could take the opportunity, Michael, there is a question that I have, which is, it seems to me that there's a challenge in conceiving of production in the developed world where we are over consumers of carbon and overproducers of the negative effects. How do we maintain that productivity directed towards a better end, sharing that productivity with the global South, but building on that same model? It seems to me that there's an inconsistency there. Do you understand what I'm asking?
Quite. Could you explain the inconsistency?
How do we? It seemed to me that you were kind of encouraging us to continue to produce in the global North, but for the benefit of the global South. But we're producing in an unsustainable way. Is there a way that we can continue to produce, but to do it sustainably?
Yes, I think so. We need to produce in a way that relies more on sustainable sources of energy, and that is paired with reduced consumption of the sorts of goods that people really need. So we need to reduce our levels of long distance travel, for example, and other sorts of things that we're used to enjoying, but that on a world scale are not any longer sustainable.
Okay, thank you. We have another question in the chat from Hugh McDermott. He asks, why is it that our politicians ignore UBI in the face of future work or not? What are their fears of an emancipated society? So I think any of our presenters could answer that question, but perhaps let me start with Kelsey. Do you have any answer from your media?
Why is it that our politicians ignore UBI in the face of future work or not? Are politicians ignoring UBI? So are politicians more inclined to go for something like a basic income with some kind of work requirements? This is still quite popular. This is still quite popular among the public, I would venture. Some kind of partnership, and even in the discussions here at this conference about UBI and things like other guarantees, like job guarantees. And we're all in agreement here, more or less, that taking away these requirements on the access end and the questions about funding it are like quite valid and I think quite answerable, and I think we have a large cadre of research to demonstrate that. What are their fears of an emancipated society? Are politicians afraid of their constituents? Is that what's motivating them? Just because we see fear as like we see it as a guiding kind of, not guiding, but it's really prevalent in our stories right now. Are we afraid of ourselves? Should we be like really confronting what this means to be an emancipated society, what our understanding of vision and progress means? Are we post-information age enlightened society?
Right, well, thank you for those thoughts. Does anyone else want to jump in on that question?
Back at it is simple ignorance of some of the research data that shows that things that people fear about basic income are exaggerated. The evidence shows that labor market withdrawal is very modest. People are still for employment. But beyond that, I think we saw this with the negative income tax proposals in the 1970s. They were fiercely resisted by the National Association of Manufacturers in the United States. And I think they knew what they were doing. They didn't want a labor force that was able to walk away from the employment that they offered. They didn't want to have to pay higher salaries that would dig into their profits. And I think some of those same motivations are at work today. And to the extent that politicians are echoing the concerns of employers, that's another reason. And a third thing that I'm really genuinely puzzled about, and this has to do with the cost of a genuinely universal basic income as opposed to a means tested but otherwise unconditional minimum income, and that is the gross cost. I mentioned a little earlier that the net cost to the net contributors of a basic income at the poverty line in the United States would be about $500 billion, but the gross cost, what the government would take in revenue and then disburse in basic income is about 6 times that. It's like 3 trillion. So that just makes some people say it's not feasible. And even when you explain that the net cost to net contributors is only 1/6 of the gross cost, people still say, well, yes, but that's an awful lot of money for the government to take in. We'd have to raise marginal tax rates, and it's kind of end of conversation. And I'm puzzled why there is such opposition to giving everybody money and then clawing some of it back. The giving and clawing back part is something that some people just, I know in Canada, it's been the source of some very heated reactions to the way payments were handled during the pandemic.
That was interesting. I think it was different in the United States. I don't think that there was that backlash against that with the stimulus payments in the United States. That actually, this last question brings up a question that I had for Fernando. In your discussion of entrepreneurial ecosystems and citizen collectives, it's two terms that I'm really not familiar with, but from the way you describe them in your talk, I'm wondering, is there an upper limit to the size of functional entrepreneurial ecosystems and citizens collectives? And one of the reasons I'm asking that is I wonder if there's an upper limit to the boundaries of trust in society. So, a lot of what these politicians may be fearing is that people actually will turn away from work. I happen to think that a basic income in many contexts will support work rather than encourage people to leave work. But is there something from your research that suggests that there's maybe an upper limit to the size of a community that could successfully implement a basic income?
Well, thanks for your question. I think that's an interesting point. When we look at the literature on entrepreneurial ecosystems, there is a huge debate on what would be the geographical boundaries of entrepreneurial ecosystems, because people talk about national entrepreneurial ecosystem, local, small communities. So there are quite different levels of approach. I believe that as I am a newcomer to the basic income studies, I'm not very comfortable making strong assertions, but I believe that there is a convergence on entrepreneurial ecosystem studies that it's best for us to try to understand how this phenomenon operates in small communities. And so I believe that would lead to the idea that if we think of basic income coming out as a result of a local or small community entrepreneurial ecosystem, it would be easier to build trust, as you say, cooperation in small number of people, I believe. On the other hand, as I was listening to Michael's Howard's presentation, and it gives a sense of a different level of universal basic income. That's the idea of how this utopia can lead to a concerted effort of nations, because as in the proposal, the North countries would have to give for. So if we apply the same idea for entrepreneurial ecosystems, we could imagine that there would be larger entrepreneurial ecosystems that have been more successful in the past that could help emerging entrepreneurial ecosystems. So it's not an easy question, but it's a good food for thought, I believe. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the.
So, yeah, you're welcome. We just have a couple of minutes left. Fun, I wanted to give you a chance to answer any of the questions or comment on anything that you've heard, since we haven't yet heard from you in the discussion part of our program. Do you have any comments you'd like to add?
I may have Yes, I can answer the Hughes question based on my research. So why is the politician ignores UBI in the face of future work? So basically, I think if a politician decide to do something, they must satisfy some people's interest. So as I have argued in my research that there is ubiquitous disagreement. That is, although some people may agree with basic income, some people there will inevitably be some other group of people who disagree with basic income. And I think one reason is that because basic income usually benefits those who have lower income, and but they don't have a great voice. And if we are going to take money from some richest people, they have a relatively larger voice. So so they can. So that is when the politicians decide to make some decisions, they can. The voice are usually from the richest people. So that's one reason I think. And what I'm arguing in my research is that as the automation goes, and it eventually will have greater and greater influence on the general people. And I think that there is an opportunity that when it meets some, there is some transition time that there will eventually greater voice who favor of basic income than those who who disagree with basic income.
Let's hope that those voices are heard. Thank you very much, Fan, for your answer, and thank you to all of our presenters for a very stimulating conversation about basic income in the context of the future of work, but also our looming ecological crisis, in our health crisis in many countries, and so on. Thank you all very much, and I think we'll wrap it up now.